Hello everyone, my name is Amanda Good. I am a recruitment specialist with Girl Scouts Spirit of Nebraska, and today we are bringing the last in our sewing series where we're going to talk about how to make a scrunchie. We're going to go over a basic scrunchie pattern as well as two simple embellishments that you can add to your scrunchies. You are going to need some thread that matches your fabric, some pins or binder clips, or some clip of some kind. I'll talk to you about why you might want those instead of pins here in just a little bit. Some sewing scissors, elastic. This is 1/4 inch elastic and each piece is 9 inches. You will need one piece for each scrunchie. You will also need your fabric. For a fluffy scrunchie, which I think is easier, you're going to want a piece of fabric that is 6 inches by 22 inches. For a skinnier scrunchie like this one, you can use a 4-inch wide piece of fabric. Some optional tools you may need are safety pins, a loop turner, or a chopstick. First thing you want to do is fold your fabric right sides together. Remember in the last video we talked about how there's a right side and a wrong side of your fabric. Now you could pin your fabric along the open end, the long open end, you could pin that together, but I find that to be a little bit tedious, especially since it's not going to take you very long to sew them together with your machine. So I like to use binder clips, and I just clip that edge together. Makes it go a little bit faster. Now before you do this step, make sure you have your sewing machine up and running. You can also hand sew these if you don't have a sewing machine. So if you don't have a sewing machine, you could use a back stitch or a split stitch or something like that to hand sew these together. It will just take a little bit longer to do. Alright, once you have it all clipped together, you're going to put the clipped side into the sewing machine. I like to take the first clip off. You're going to put down your presser foot and you are going to leave at least an inch before you start sewing. We're going to need that space later. So you're going to sew forward, back stitch a couple stitches, and you're going to sew all the way down the length of your fabric except for another inch at the other end. So you're going to leave an inch gap at each end. That's very important. Remember to take your clips or pins out as you go. And remember to keep the edge of your fabric lined up with the edge of your presser foot. Alright, then when you get to that other end, remember to stop about an inch before the end. Back stitch a couple stitches, and then you can lift your presser foot, pull out your fabric, and snip the ends of your thread. Alright, now here's the tricky part. We need to flip this inside out, but not completely inside out. We want to turn the end inside of itself in the tube so that the one end meets with the other end so that we can sew the two ends together. So here's a handy tool that you don't necessarily need but will make things easier. It's called a loop turner. I got mine for about $4 at the fabric store. You just insert the loop turner into one end of your tube, and then you're going to take that little hook on the end and kind of pierce the fabric with the hook and close the little closure, the little metal piece on the end there. And that's just going to help you pull one end to the other end. If you don't have a loop turner, you can do it by hand. Sometimes having a safety pin on the end helps. It's not super difficult when you have a wide piece of fabric. So you're going to pull the one end towards you. Normally you would keep going and pull it all the way inside out, but you want to stop when the two ends meet. So you can see that I'm placing my right sides of my fabric together, I'm lining up the seam, and I'm lining up my corners, and that's why it's really important that we left that inch gap on each end. Now you can clip or pin this You don't necessarily need to, but if it's going to help you make sure that your fabric stays in place, by all means, go for it. When I sew this part, I like to clip the ends where that inch gap is, sometimes in the middle too, just to help hold it together. So you're going to sew that end together in a loop. This can be kind of tricky. It's a little bit of a small space, so you just want to go slow and, you know, turn your fabric every few stitches. Start sewing, make sure you back stitch at the end. And you can see that I kind of sew for about an inch, maybe less, and then manipulate the fabric how I need to so that it doesn't sew on top of itself, so it doesn't overlap in any way that I don't want it to. So sew and turn, sew and turn. All the way to the end. Backstitch. And clip your threads. Now that inch gap that we talked about at the very beginning has become more important. So you're going to pull the inside of the scrunchie out through that 1 inch gap on the side. And it's going to be a circle of fabric with the right side out. The next thing you want to do is put your elastic in. So you're going to pick up your 9-inch piece of elastic and a safety pin. If you have one, safety pin is going to make it much easier to do this. And you're just going to thread the elastic onto the safety pin. I usually pierce it with the safety pin a couple times before closing it. And you're going to insert the elastic into that hole that we pulled the scrunchie out through. And the safety pin is going to make it easier because you can feel the safety pin through the fabric much easier than you can feel the elastic. So you're going to hold the elastic with one hand and feed it through the tube of fabric with the other hand. You can see how I hold the loose end of the elastic with my pinky and my ring finger to kind of make sure that it doesn't get lost inside the scrunchie. So once the elastic has gone all the way through, you can see that your scrunchie now looks like a scrunchie. It's all scrunched up. You're going to pull both ends of the elastic together, take the safety pin out, and you're going to match those ends up and tie them in a knot. Now you can sew them together if you want to. I usually don't. Most of the scrunchies I've purchased, like from a store, you can feel inside that the elastic is knotted. Make sure the knot is really tight, really close to the ends. I'm going to stick the end of the elastic, stick the knot back inside there, fold the ends of that gap closed, and clip it or pin it so that it stays together. And then we are going to sew that gap closed. This is called top stitching. So you want to make sure that you start your top stitching a little bit beyond the boundaries of the gap. So you want to start it past where the gap starts and end it past where the gap starts. And you want your top stitching to be pretty close to the edge of your fabric, but not so close that it's falling off. Now if your machine has a little bit of trouble getting over that seam, just do what I did and lift the presser foot just a little bit and keep sewing. Make sure you sew past where the gap ends and backstitch at the beginning and ending of your seam. And then snip those extra threads off. Now again, this makes for a super fluffy scrunchie, but it is easier to make. If you wanted a skinnier scrunchie, you could make your fabric piece 4 inches wide instead of 6 inches wide. but here's what you get as a result. All right, we're going to run through that process one more time, a little bit faster. So remember, you need, for a fluffy scrunchie, a 6" by 22" piece of fabric, right sides together, pin the long side, Step 2, sew that long side together, being sure to leave about a 1" gap on each end, and making sure that you back stitch at the beginning and the ending of your stitching. Using a loop turner or a safety pin, turn your fabric tube halfway inside out so that the ends meet. Line up the edges and sew. Make sure to leave the 1" gap on the side. Be careful to turn the fabric as you sew so that it doesn't overlap on itself. Pull the scrunchie right side out through the 1" gap on the side. Thread your piece of elastic onto a safety pin. And feed the safety pin into the scrunchie through the gap on the side. Be sure to hold on to the elastic so that it doesn't get lost inside the fabric of the scrunchie. Once you have fed the elastic all the way through, pull out the safety pin end and take the safety pin off. Match the ends and tie in a very tight knot. Tuck the knot inside, fold the edges over, and top stitch your gap closed. And there's how you make a very basic, very fluffy scrunchie. Now for some simple embellishments you can add. We're going to talk about how to add some bunny ears as well as a long bow. You are going to need the pattern piece we've included with this video, fabric wide enough for 2 of those pattern pieces for the bunny ears, as well as a long piece of fabric if you want the long tie. And this is what they look like when they're all put together. We are going to start with the easier of the 2, which is the long bow. So I like to put these kinds of embellishments on skinnier scrunchies because it's just easier to tie them around. For a long bow, I cut a piece of fabric that was about 3 inches by 30 inches. And I notched the ends, so I cut the ends in an angle, which is not necessary, but just something that I chose to do. So I am going to fold my fabric right sides together. I'm going to pin it all in place. Once I am done pinning my fabric together, I'm going to start to sew. When you are done sewing the long edge of your fabric, whether you left your ends square or whether you angled them like mine, you need to turn your fabric all the way inside out. So this is how you can do that with a safety pin. The safety pin on the edge, on the seam. Tip it into the tube itself. And kind of like with feeding the elastic into the scrunchie, you're just going to kind of push the safety pin along inside the fabric and guide the fabric to turn inside out. Once the ends are together, pull your fabric tube all the way inside out. Straighten your tie out, and then you're going to sew the ends together. So tip the seam in towards the inside, fold the edges in on themselves, and get it all straightened out nice. Put a pin or a clip in that. And then do the same thing on the other side. Tip the seam in and fold all the edges in. And then just like how we had to top stitch the gap of our scrunchie closed, we're going to top stitch the ends of this tie closed. Now when I finished sewing my tie, I did iron it flat. You don't have to do that, but if you have an adult that can help you, even better. Then you're going to put your scrunchie on the tie and match your ends up together. And then just tie it in a bow. Now for our next addition to our scrunchies, we're going to make a little bunny ear tie. So you need a piece of fabric that is basically 4 times as big as our pattern piece that we've included in this post. You should be able to just print that pattern piece out, but if you don't have a printer, the measurements in centimeters are on it. You're going to fold your fabric in half and line up your pattern piece with the small end to the fold of the fabric. Pin that onto your fabric. You can't use clips here, unfortunately. You just want it pinned enough so that it doesn't move. Then you're going to use your fabric scissors. Remember to use fabric scissors to cut fabric, paper scissors to cut your pattern piece out. And I like to cut my fabric down a little bit before I cut my pattern piece out. Cut right along your paper pattern piece. And you're going to need to make 2 of these. Just cut that out right along the paper. Be very careful not to poke yourself with the pins. After you've cut out the first piece, take the pins out of your pattern and reuse that pattern piece for the second piece. Once again, line it up with the fold, pin it down so it doesn't move, and carefully cut it out. Then take all the pins out. You can save your pattern piece for later if you want to add some bunny ear ties to other scrunchies that you make. But for right now, you're going to unfold those 2 pieces that you just cut out, and you're going to match them up right sides together and pin them. Because this pattern piece has some curves to it, I like to use pins rather than clips, just because they keep it a little bit flatter. It's a little bit easier to sew. Now when you pin this, keep in mind that after you are done pinning and you start to sew, just like with our scrunchie, we're going to need to leave a gap. So I like to leave my gap on a side with a curve or the straight end, something that's easier to fold the edges in and sew together, I would recommend not leaving your gap on the pointed end. I do, however, like to start my sewing on the pointed end, so I'm going to lift my presser foot, line up the end, and very carefully start my sewing and making sure that I backstitch at the end. When you are sewing curves, you want to sew extra slowly and make sure you're paying very close attention and turning your fabric as you sew. So making sure you're following the outline of your fabric. If you go too fast, it won't follow the curve and it won't turn out right. You can see I'm also sewing pretty close to the edge here. That's what you want as well. Now starting at one pointed end and working your way towards the other pointed end, making sure you follow those curves. When you get to that pointed end, you're going to need to turn the corner. So what you're going to do is you're going to pause, use the hand wheel on your sewing machine to lower the needle, lift the presser foot with the needle in the fabric, and adjust the fabric so that you can continue to sew along the curves. That is why I would not recommend leaving the gap in your fabric at the pointed end of the tie. Alright, so once I get to a point where I have about an inch left of fabric to sew, I'm going to stop, backstitch, and pull my fabric out, snip the threads, and then we're going to turn it right side out. So through that gap, just like we have before, I'm going to turn all of that fabric inside out. You can use a loop turner, you can use a safety pin. For something this small, it's easy enough just to use your fingers. Alright, once it is all turned right side out, you can use a chopstick to help push if it gets too cramped. Just like with our long bow tie, fold the ends in, top stitch closed. And then snip your extra threads. Now I also ironed this one flat. You can do that if you want to, not a requirement. Similar to the bow, you're going to thread your scrunchie on and then just tie it in a knot. Alright, so in this series we learned how to hand sew, we learned how to sew a button, we learned how to thread a machine, and we learned how to make some really cute scrunchies. We really hope that you enjoyed our sewing series and all of our other Girl Scouts at Home content. Please show us what you've made, and thank you for watching.